This 1856 daguerreotype of a couple looks romantic until you notice the paper beneath his hand. The image had sat in a university archive for decades, catalogued as a simple betrothal portrait. It looked tender, almost hopeful. Until the day a curator named Maria Reeves held the plate under magnification and saw the seal pressed into the wax. Maria had been working in the Louisiana collection at Tulane for 11 years. She had seen hundreds of daguerreotypes from antebellum New Orleans, images of merchants and their families, society portraits, post-mortem keepsakes. This one had been donated in 1923 by the estate of a minor shipping family, boxed with 24 other plates and never properly examined. The donor note said only, "Betrothal portrait, circa 1856. The couple sits close but not touching, except where their hands meet over a folded document on a small table between them. The man is perhaps 30, clean-shaven, wearing a dark coat that suggests middling prosperity. The woman looks younger, 20 at most, her dress plain but well-fitted, her hair pulled back in the style free women of color wore in the city. Her expression is calm, almost blank. His face shows something harder to read, pride maybe, or something closer to defiance. Maria adjusted the angle of the light. The daguerreotype's silver surface threw back reflections, but at the right tilt, details emerged that a casual glance would miss. The paper beneath their joined hands was folded twice, creating a thick packet. A red wax seal held it closed. She leaned closer. The seal bore an impression, not a family crest or initial, something else. She reached for the stereoscope they used for fine detail work. The seal showed a ship in profile and 3 letters beneath it, B, F, and C. Maria sat back. She knew those initials. Bienville Factors Collective, one of the largest slave-trading firms operating out of New Orleans in the 1850s. Their office had been on Chartres Street, near the St. Louis Hotel where the auctions were held. This was not a love letter under their hands. This was a bill of sale. Maria had started in archives because she liked the quietness, the way old things stayed still and let you think. But over the years, she had learned that no photograph is ever really still. Every image is a decision about what to show and what to hide, and the things people chose to hide in plain sight were often the things that mattered most. She had found death in christening portraits, poverty beneath fine clothes, violence in the empty spaces where people should have been standing. But this was different. This was someone asking the camera to witness something that should not have needed witnessing at all. She turned the daguerreotype case over. On the back, written in faded ink, a single line, Jacques Lemel and Céline, June 1856. No surname for Céline. That alone told a story. Maria photographed the seal under magnification, then began the research that would consume the next 8 months of her life. She started where she always started, with the photographer. New Orleans had dozens of daguerreotype studios in the 1850s, most clustered along Royal Street in Chartres. The case had no photographer's mark, but the style of the mat and the quality of the plate suggested one of the better establishments. She pulled the city directories for 1855 and 1856, cross-referenced with advertisements in the Daily Picayune. 3 studios were possibilities. She wrote to descendants, checked business records, and finally found a ledger from Armand Dulac's studio on Royal Street that listed a sitting for J. Lemel in June of 1856. No mention of a second subject, which was common when one of the sitters was not considered socially equal to the other. Census records gave her Jacques Lemel, a clerk working for a cotton factor on Choupitoulas Street, born in France, arrived in New Orleans in 1849, listed as white, living in a boarding house on Rampart Street, no property, no enslaved people in his name, unmarried as of 1860. Céline was harder. She did not appear in the 1850 census as free, but the 1860 census showed a Céline Lemel, mulatto, living on Dauphine Street, listed as a seamstress. The coincidence of the surname was suggestive but not proof. Many free people of color took the names of former enslavers or protectors without any formal relationship. Maria needed an expert who understood the legal architecture of slavery and freedom in 1850s Louisiana. She contacted Dr. Raymond Thibault, a historian at the University of New Orleans, who had written extensively on manumission practices in the antebellum South. They met in his campus office on a humid afternoon in September. She showed him the daguerreotype on her laptop, zoomed in on the seal. Raymond leaned forward. Bienville factors. They handled sales, but they also processed manumission paperwork when it was tied to a purchase. After 1852, Louisiana law required anyone freeing an enslaved person to post bond and prove the person could support themselves. The process went through the district court, but the trading firms often brokered the transaction. "So this could be a freedom document," Maria said. "It could be. But here's what makes this complicated. If Jacques Lamel bought Celine's freedom, the law would still recognize him as having a financial interest in her. She would be free, but the document connecting them would look almost identical to a bill of sale. In the eyes of the state, manumission was just another form of property transfer." Maria thought about that. And if they wanted to marry? Raymond's expression darkened. They could not. Louisiana prohibited marriage between white people and anyone with African ancestry. The law was absolute. Even if she was legally free, even if he loved her, the state would never recognize them as husband and wife. The best they could do was live together and hope no one challenged the arrangement. And if someone did challenge it, their children would be illegitimate. Any property she accumulated could be disputed. If he died, she would have no claim as a widow. She would be legally invisible. Maria asked him to look deeper into the Bienville factors' collective records, anything that might reference Jacques Lamel or a woman named Celine. She began her own search through the district court archives, looking for manumission petitions filed in 1855 and 1856. It took 3 weeks, but she found it. A petition dated April 14, 1856, filed by Jacques Lamel on behalf of a woman of color named Celine, aged 19 years, currently held by the estate of Madame V. Hébert. The petition stated that Jacques Lamel agreed to pay the sum of $800 for Celine's freedom, and to post a bond of $200 guaranteeing that she would not become a public charge. The petition included a sworn statement from Celine that she possessed skills in needlework and domestic service and could support herself as a free woman. The court approved the petition on May 30, 1856. 2 weeks later, they sat for a daguerreotype. But the petition also included something Maria had not expected, a note appended by the court clerk. Petitioner states intention to marry said woman pending removal to jurisdiction permitting such union. They had told the court they planned to leave Louisiana. Maria did not know if that should make the image more heartbreaking or less. They had sat for this portrait knowing it might be the only formal record of their bond, the only proof that what they felt for each other had weight in the world. The folded paper between their hands was not a symbol of love triumphing. It was a map of every barrier the law had placed in their way. She needed to understand what it meant to live in that gap between freedom and full personhood. She traveled to New Orleans, spent a week in the city's historical archives and libraries. She walked the streets where Jacques and Celine would have walked. The old French Quarter looked polished now, full of tourists and restaurants, but the bones of the city were still there. The courtyards where enslaved people had lived in quarters behind the main houses, the markets where they had been sold, the churches where free people of color had worshipped separately from whites, their names recorded in different registers. At the New Orleans Public Library, she found a parish record from St. Augustine Church, the church established for free people of color. A baptism entry from 1858. Emile, son of Celine Lamel, free woman of color, and father unknown. Another entry in 1860. Marguerite, daughter of Celine Lamel, free woman of color, and father unknown. Father unknown. The law forced that lie. Jacques could not be named as the father because naming him would create a legal record of an interracial relationship, and that was something the state refused to acknowledge. Their children existed in a legal void, connected to their mother, but severed from half their lineage. Maria contacted Dr. Erica Dorsey, a specialist in 19th century family law at Howard University. They spoke by video call, and Maria showed her the daguerreotype and the documents she had gathered. This is classic legal erasure, Dr. Dorsey said. The state created a system where love became property law, where every intimate choice had to pass through the language of sale and ownership. And for the people trapped in that system, every act of resistance or preservation was a risk. Sitting for this portrait was a risk. Keeping the document visible in the image was a risk. They were saying, here is proof, here is what we are to each other, and the only way they could say it was by holding the paper that should never have existed in the first place. Maria asked what would have happened if they had tried to leave Louisiana. Legally, they could have gone north or west to a free state. But think about what that required. Jacques would have had to abandon whatever work or life he had built in New Orleans. Céline would have been traveling with a white man she could not legally marry, carrying children whose birth records would mark them as illegitimate. They would have been vulnerable at every checkpoint, every border, every town where someone might question their relationship. And if they went somewhere that did allow interracial marriage, they would still be starting over with no resources and no legal protection for anything they had left behind. Maria thought about the expression on Céline's face in the daguerreotype. Not joy, not hope, just a strange, flat endurance. She went back to the records. She searched for evidence that Jacques and Céline had left New Orleans, but she found none. The 1860 census listed Jacques Lamel still in the city, still working as a clerk, still unmarried. Céline Lamel lived across town with 2 children. There was no documentation that they shared a household, though that meant little. Plenty of interracial couples in New Orleans maintained separate addresses to avoid legal trouble. But in 1862, the trail ended. Jacques Lamel disappeared from the city directories and census records. Céline's name appeared one more time in the 1870 census, living on Dauphine Street, listed as a widow, though she had never legally been a wife. Her children were grown by then, both listed with occupations. Émile was a carpenter. Marguerite was a teacher. Both used the surname Lamel. Maria found one more document, a deed recorded in 1867, showing that Céline Lamel purchased a small house on Dauphine Street for $300. The seller was listed as the succession of Jacques Lamel, deceased. Somehow, despite the lack of legal marriage, he had left her something. Maybe through a trust or an informal arrangement with his executor. Maybe by structuring the sale to look like a normal property transaction. The law made it nearly impossible. But people found ways. That was where the archival trail ended. Céline died sometime before 1880, her death unrecorded in any register Maria could find. Her children disappeared into the sprawl of post-war New Orleans, their descendants scattered or lost to time. Maria prepared a report for the university archive, outlining everything she had learned. She recommended that the daguerreotype be reinterpreted and placed in a new context within the collection, with full explanatory text about manumission law and anti-miscegenation statutes. She suggested that it could anchor an exhibition about the hidden lives of interracial couples in the antebellum South. The response was cautious. The archive's director, a careful man named Robert Chauvin, convened a meeting with the curatorial staff, the head of the history department, and 2 members of the university's donor relations team. They gathered in a conference room in the Special Collections building. Maria presented the daguerreotype on a screen, walked them through her research, showed them the documents and the legal framework that had trapped Jacques and Céline. Robert listened carefully, his hands folded on the table. When Maria finished, he spoke slowly. This is important work. I want to be clear about that, but I need to think about how we present this publicly. We have donors whose families were part of that world. Some of them have antebellum portraits in our collection, donated with the understanding that we would honor their ancestors. If we start reinterpreting every photograph as evidence of exploitation or violence, we risk alienating the people who make this archive possible. Maria had expected this. I'm not asking us to condemn everyone in every old photograph. I'm asking us to tell the truth about this one. Jacques and Céline are not abstractions. They were real people who tried to build a life together in a system designed to prevent exactly that. The document in this image is proof of how the law dehumanized them both. Ignoring that is not neutral. It is a choice to keep the story hidden. One of the donor relations staff, a woman named Catherine, spoke up. Could we present it as a love story, emphasize the resilience, the way they found each other despite the obstacles? We can do that, Maria said, but we cannot do it without also naming what the obstacles were. This is not a story about love conquering all. It is a story about love constrained by property law, about 2 people who could not marry, whose children were legally erased, who were forced to live in the margins because the state refused to see them as fully human. That is the story. If we soften it, We are lying. The room was quiet. Dr. Paul Mendez, a historian specializing in Civil War-era Louisiana, finally spoke. Maria is right. This photograph has been sitting in our archive for a century, labeled as a betrothal portrait. Every student, every researcher who saw it accepted that story, because we did not bother to question it. We owe it to Jacques and Céline and to every other person whose image we hold to do the work of understanding what we are actually looking at. That is our job. Robert nodded slowly. All right, let us move forward with a reinterpretation, but I want the language to be precise, grounded in the documents. No speculation, no melodrama. Let the facts speak. Maria agreed. She spent the next 2 months writing the exhibition text and working with a designer to create a display that would give the daguerreotype the context it deserved. The exhibition opened in April, a small but carefully constructed show in the Archives Public Gallery. The centerpiece was the daguerreotype, enlarged and displayed beside a translation of the manumission petition, the parish baptism records, and a timeline showing the evolution of Louisiana's laws around slavery, freedom, and marriage. The text explained how Jacques Lemel had purchased Céline's freedom but could not marry her, how their children were recorded without a father, how the law treated love as a property transaction. A second panel showed excerpts from other manumission petitions, demonstrating that Jacques and Céline were not unique, that hundreds of people in New Orleans had navigated the same cruel legal maze. One section of the exhibition included oral histories from descendants of free people of color in New Orleans, recorded by researchers in the 1970s and 1980s. Several spoke about the ways their ancestors had preserved family stories that official records refused to tell. One interview with a woman named Mrs. Claudine Bertrand stood out. She described how her great-grandmother had kept a box of documents, bills of sale and manumission papers, and refused to destroy them even though they were painful reminders of what the family had survived. She said people would want to forget, Mrs. Bertrand explained in the recording. But forgetting is how they win. The exhibition drew attention beyond the university. A journalist from the Times-Picayune wrote a feature about the daguerreotype and the research behind it. Historians and educators reached out to ask if the materials could be used in classrooms and conferences. Several people contacted the archive claiming possible family connections to Céline or Jacques, though none could be confirmed. But the most unexpected response came from a retired schoolteacher in Baton Rouge named Vivian Lemel. She wrote to Maria saying she had read the article and wondered if there might be a connection to her own family. Her great-great-grandfather had been named Émile Lemel, a carpenter in New Orleans in the 1870s. She had a photograph of him, taken later in life. She also had a small wooden box he had made with a hidden compartment that held a single daguerreotype. Maria arranged to meet her. They sat in Vivian's living room on a warm Saturday in June. Vivian brought out the box, a simple piece of carpentry. Cypress wood with brass hinges. She opened the hidden compartment and removed a daguerreotype in a worn leather case. It was the same image, Jacques and Céline, hands joined over the folded paper. He kept it all his life, Vivian said. I never knew what it was. I thought it was just a picture of some relatives. My grandmother told me once that our family had French blood, but she did not say much more than that. People did not talk about these things. Maria felt something loosen in her chest. The daguerreotype in the archive had been a record. This one, passed down through Émile, was proof that the story had mattered to the people who lived it, that it had been worth preserving. Your great-great-grandfather is in the baptism records at St. Augustine Church, Maria said gently. He was Céline's son. His father was Jacques Lemel, but the law would not let them record that. This image was probably the only proof Émile had of who his father was. Vivian looked at the daguerreotype for a long time. They look so serious, she said finally. I always thought old pictures just looked that way because people did not smile. But now I think maybe they had reasons. The university made a high-resolution scan of Vivian's daguerreotype and displayed it alongside the archive's copy in the exhibition. The label explained that this was the same image, kept by the family, proof that what looked like a romantic portrait was actually a desperate act of documentation. The exhibition text was updated to include Émile's story and the fact that descendants still held pieces of the family history. The exhibition ran for 6 months. After it closed, the daguerreotype returned to the archive's permanent collection, but now with a new catalog entry that told the full story. Students and researchers who encountered it would no longer see a simple betrothal portrait. They would see Jacques and Céline, caught between love and law, holding the document that had freed her but could not make them equal. The power of old photographs lies in what they refuse to say out loud. Every portrait from the 19th century is a negotiation with the camera, a decision about what story to tell and what evidence to leave behind. The wealthy used photographs to cement their respectability, to project a vision of order and refinement that often depended on the labor and suffering of people who were not allowed in the frame. But sometimes, in the corners of those images, in the details no one was supposed to notice, other stories survived. The paper beneath Jacques' hand should have been invisible. It should have been just another prop in a conventional portrait. But by keeping it visible, by making sure the seals showed, by sitting together as if they had the right to be seen that way, they created a record that outlasted the laws designed to erase them. For more than a century, no one looked closely enough to see what they were holding, but the evidence was always there, pressed into wax, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. There are thousands of daguerreotypes like this one, sitting in archives and attics and estate sales, catalogued with stories that do not quite fit the images. Portraits of children whose expressions suggest something other than the prosperity their clothes imply. Family groups where one person stands too far away or holds themselves too stiffly. Their presence in the frame a concession to power rather than affection. Couples whose intimacy is visible only in a single gesture, a touch of hands over a document that should not need to exist. Every photograph is evidence, but evidence of what depends on whether anyone is willing to look closely enough to see what the image is trying to hide, or what it is quietly, desperately trying to preserve.